Hello, and welcome to Deep Dive with Harry Turpin, a conversation with. I'm your host, Harry Turpin, and thank you first and foremost to you for being here with us this Tuesday evening. For those of you who are new to the show, here's how it works. I'll have a guest and a series of questions to help guide the conversation. Throughout the course of the evening, if my guest says something I want to know more about, we'll take a deep dive. The conversation will take us where it takes us, but always strives to be thought-provoking and engaging. At the end of the evening, you'll have a chance to ask my guests any questions you may have. I can't guarantee I will get to each one, but will definitely do my best. And you can ask those questions by submitting them through the Facebook live stream event or through our YouTube channel. Be sure to take a moment to like or subscribe to Deep Dive with Harry Turpin on YouTube and leave your feedback. I'd love to know what you think of the show. Before we begin, I'd like to take this moment to state that Black Lives Matter. Now, about our show tonight and our guest. I'm very excited to welcome to the show Kathy Hsieh. Kathy, pronouns she, her, is a theater producer and an award-winning actor, writer, and director who has performed on stages throughout the country, on TV and film. Recent projects include Raisins and a Glass of Milk, The Brothers Paranormal with Porkalob Productions, and Romeo Juliet with Seattle Shakespeare's WoodenO. She has also worked with Sound Theater, React, the Seattle Rep, Book It, Act, Intiman, Taproot, the 1448 Projects, Freehold, Living Voices, and more. Kathy's accolades and celebrations are many and across many disciplines, having received a recent Seattle Theater Writers Gypsy Award for acting in Washer Dryer for SIS Productions and Pratidhwani, plus Footlight and Seattle Theater Writers Gypsy Awards for acting in Chinglish by David Henry Hwang at ArtsWest, and was nominated for an Ellie Award for the same role with Cats in Nevada City. She has been honored by the National Association of Asian American Professionals in Seattle as their Artist of the Year and as an actor by ArtsFund in 2003. Received a special award of recognition by the Seattle Theater Writers Gypsy Awards for excellence in playwriting and Verizon's Asian Pacific American Bash's Innovator Award in 2012. Pardon me. She is also the 2015 International Examiner Community Voice Awardee in the arts. She's received the Gregory Award for Sustained Achievement in 2017 and the Seattle Chinese American Citizens Alliance 2019 Fred Yee Citizens Award. Kathy is the Cultural Partnerships and Grants Manager for the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, helping the agency earn the Seattle Management Association's first Race and Social Justice Management Award in 2007. She is also one of the founders and co-executive producers for SIS Productions, an Asian American women-led theater company recognized by Audrey Magazine as a theater trailblazer. Please welcome to the show, Kathy Hsieh. Hi, Kathy.
How are you, Harry?
How are you?
Good.
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Good. Thanks so much for doing this and giving up your Tuesday evening to spend an hour and a half with me and our viewers.
I'm honored.
I'm so excited to have you. So we're going to dive in because we've got a lot of material to cover, and just want to remind folks, if you are watching, if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the comments field on the YouTube stream or on your Facebook, and we will make sure to pop them up. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. So, Kathy, we're going to dive in. Let's start at the very, very beginning. What was the calling like to be on stage? How did that happen for you?
Actually, I think the very first role I had was playing the star in a Christmas pageant at school. Not the North Star, but like just a star in the sky. I was like 4.5 or something like that. The interesting thing about that experience was just that the reason why I ended up in a Christian school was because my parents were immigrants to this country and they didn't know that there was public education. So they kind of drove around the neighborhood.
Really?
Yeah. So they kind of drove around the neighborhood, found a school, and it happened to be a Christian school, private school. And so that's where they enrolled my brother and I for me for kindergarten through first grade, part of second grade. And then their friends were telling them, why are you paying so much money for school? There's schools. And then that's how we got transferred into a public school later. But I think if it had not been for that experience, I might not have discovered acting at that young age. And then later on, my brother and I, throughout our whole childhood, were like less than 11 months apart. We were latchkey kids. So we spent all of our time after school role playing, like with our stuffed animals. We created a whole animal world. So that was kind of, for me, I think it was just a way to kind of disappear into other characters. And I also, again, because my parents were immigrants, I learned in school that most kids got read to bed before they went to sleep. So I used to read stories to my brother, and I would act out all the characters. So when in high school, our language arts teacher insisted that every single person audition for the school play. And I did, and I was lucky I got cast. I was like the first freshman at Nathan Hale High School to get cast in a show, and it was such an amazing experience working with mostly seniors and juniors. We did Plaza Suite by Neil Simon. I played the other woman in that first scene, and it was such a small role. But there was something about the fact I knew nothing. Like, I didn't know what upstage was, downstage, anything. And all the seniors, it was a very diverse cast, and they were just so helpful and nice. And who in high school as a freshman gets treated nicely by other people? But what I really fell in love with was just the collaboration of all of us working together. It wasn't competitive. It was just really supporting each other through a process so that we could all, do our best. And then when we opened and had an audience, that first time in front of an audience, realizing I was a really shy, introverted middle schooler in particular. So going into high school was really terrifying. But to have an experience where instead of getting treated really awfully like I had in middle school, when people saw me up there on stage, even as small a part as it was, they were just so supportive, and the applause just makes you feel like, wow, for the first time in my life, I actually felt seen by people. And that was phenomenal. So that kind of, two shows. I saw one play where it was at the Children's Theater. I was doing a production of The Runaways there. And the show that was playing on their main stage was an all Asian American cast. It was an Asian folktale. But I was blown away because for the first time, I actually saw people who looked like me. Now, I'd been doing a lot of theater throughout high school, but this was the first time I actually saw a play where people looked like me. And I know for a lot of people, that might not seem like such a big deal, but when you're Asian American growing up here in Seattle and on TV and on film and every kind of media representation in magazines at that time, there were no faces barely of people of color, let alone Asian American faces. So to actually see on stage people, it was transformative. And that's when I knew I had the possibility of maybe even considering this as a career. But then shortly after that, when I was in college, I saw a production of Bookett's play about Booker T. Washington. And it was a solo show with an African American actor. And he was so phenomenal. I mean, he blew my mind. I didn't know that you could go on such a roller coaster journey with just one person, and that was it. And for the whole, I think it was just 65-minute play, I was mesmerized. And I thought to myself, because I had already at that young age knew how inequitable the world was in terms of how our country treats Black people, and especially Black men. And to see that show, I thought, how could anyone see so much talent, a human being with such a huge gift to share with the world, and not believe that Black people are the same as everybody else, and have so much to offer if we didn't deny them the potential of what they had to offer. And that show was transformative, because that's when I realized that I didn't want to just be an actor. I actually wanted to create opportunities that allowed more Black people and people of color to be able to share their voice and share their gifts and live up to that full potential that the whole world misses out on when they're denied that because their lives are cut short.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You said a couple of things in there that just resonate so deeply in terms of being seen and seeing people on TV and in media, and particularly that show where you saw somebody who looked like you for the first time, and moving in terms of creating opportunities for Black people and people of color. And I wonder if maybe we hinted at it in your bio, and it's not really a part of the list of the questions, but if you could talk a little bit just in terms of the work that you did go on to create as a producer and things like that, just for creating opportunities with SIS Productions and beyond. If you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah. So much. I am old. So, so maybe just some cherry picking of stuff. With SIS Productions, so we're skipping ahead many years from that point. With SIS, but though actually now I realize, SIS Productions this August will be celebrating our 20th anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah. We came about because a group of friends and I, other local theater people, we were just hanging out one night talking about relationships and talking about, like, how did we each like learn about dating and about the other sex and just what sexuality was. And so, and the reason why it's because in television and in film and in books and in everything, popular culture, you never saw, back then, you never saw Asian Americans dating other Asian Americans. Almost always, if they had an Asian woman, it was always someone who fell in love with some white guy and then committed suicide later. I mean,
oh my gosh, a trophy wife, some sort of situation like that, right?
Yeah, so that's kind of stereotype that we're seeing all the time. And so, and television played out like that, and film played out like that, where maybe sometimes when they had a mixed race couple that wasn't an Asian woman with a white guy, it was an Asian woman with a black guy. But rarely did you see Asian Americans actually loving and falling in love and getting married with other Asian Americans, whether it was straight, gay, or bi relationships. You never saw it, period. And so, and we were talking about the fact that, because most of our parents were immigrants, they never really had the talk with us.
Interesting.
Like my mom, actually, I remember when I was like 12, I happened to walk through the room when my mom was on the phone with her friend and overheard part of the conversation. And her friend was asking my mom, "So have you had the talk with Kathy?" And my mom was like, "Oh, there's so much stuff on American television. She'll learn it that way." and that was that. And I have a lot of funny stories about my mom, which maybe we have at the time at the end we'll get to. But like the things I would learn about life through her were things like, I was like 13 and she'd be reading the newspaper, and all of a sudden I'd be doing my homework at the dining room table, and then she'd look up from her newspaper and say, "Kathy, if you ever have kids, take the drugs." And then go back to reading her newspaper. And those were like the sound bites of how she shared bits of information with me. But in terms of the dating scene, because she never had conversations, like I didn't know anything. And so I did have to kind of pick it up from television, but in television it showed me that Asians didn't date other Asians. So it was very bizarre. So anyway, my friends and I, getting back to SIS Productions, we ended up creating a show where we thought, well, if it doesn't exist, let's create it. So we created this episodic show because we felt like if we only did one show, because this is what always happens with people of color in theater and in film, is when you see one representation, a lot of people, they think everybody's like that. So when all the images that you see are of Asian women falling in love with white guys and then committing suicide, then you just think that that's like the whole story of who we are as Asian American women. Or when all you ever see of depictions of African American people are as slaves in these historical dramas, then you don't actually ever get to see who we really are in modern times. So what we wanted to do was not just do one show and not just have one protagonist, but we wanted to have an episodic show where we had 4 different women as the leads, because we're all different and unique, just like everyone else. We are not a monolith. We want to show the diversity of who we are. And over time, we want to show people might come in with their perceptions of who we are, but then over time, with each unfolding of each episode, you get to know us so well that you realize that you feel like you've made a whole world of friends that happen to be very diverse. And in our show, even though the 4 main characters are Asian American women, we really want to show it as being very modern and contemporary, because all of us were actresses who our whole careers up until that point, and I was the oldest of the 4, had always been either historical dramas where I'm stuck in concentration camp for Americans of Japanese ancestry, or, I'm, like I'm a Saigon type character, or I'm playing, there are almost always these historical dramas about the experience and the trauma of Asians in this country in relation to our complex history with America. Why a lot of Asians ended up coming to this country is through a very complex, layered, problematic, hugely problematic history. And so a lot of the stories are really dark, and pretty much every show I've ever done, I can cry on cue pretty well because I had to cry for pretty much every role I had to play. And we just wanted to do something that was fun and light and romantic. And so we created the first kind of romantic comedy 20 years ago, long before Crazy Rich Asians became a thing. And it was a way to break stereotypes. It was a way to challenge what people's perceptions of who Asian Americans were. And we actually had a lot of white reviewers come to see the show and not get it. They would actually say things like, why, like, this show isn't talking about race. Why? It's just like light entertainment. So like they didn't get like why we should even do it. And the thing was, I'm going to share a story, and I know this is going deep dive.
That's okay. Do it. This is your hour. Do it.
At the same time that our romantic comedy shows was going on, there was another show at another theater that no longer exists, but they had a long-running show, and it was all about like the small town Americana. So a lot of the characters were very white trash, I guess is the word. I hate using that term. And then there was actually another episodic show that was carried in from New York, and another the same local company was doing that episodic show too. So a whole bunch of episodic shows at that time. But those shows are really campy and just done for fun, tongue in cheek, really, really funny shows. I went to go see a lot of them, and they were hilarious shows, right? So our shows were running at the same time. There was actually one review that happened at the same time from the same local paper. And the reviewer said, yeah, this show was so fun, and it's light and silly, and it's worth seeing because it's just so funny. And then they reviewed our show in that same paper, and at the same time, and they said, here's a show about Asian Americans, and it says it's trying to break stereotypes. It was really funny. Like everyone in the audience was really laughing, and it seems really light, but why weren't they talking about race? Why weren't they addressing like issues of what it means to be Asian American? Why weren't they they literally had a whole list of questions of why weren't we doing all these things? And that is a form of racism, and this is the subtle racism that people of color experience all the time that most people don't understand, because they were putting a double standard on us, a higher expectation of why do white people get to do a show and have it be funny and campy and just be entertaining and have the audience laugh, and that's enough? And why is it whenever a person of color is in a play, there's an expectation that it has to be about race, or it has to be about heavy subjects, or it has to be about, trauma porn, where it shows the trauma at living lives of people of color in this country? Those things have their place. I've done so many of those shows, and a lot of them are actually beautifully written, have huge meaning because they do share a history of our oppression in this country. But sometimes as artists of color, we want to be able to do shows like anybody else, and to be treated equally with the same expectations of everybody else, not expect to have to do more and then be judged to be less because we didn't do things in a different way than everyone else is. But the irony is that we had sold out. We sold out shows. Every single show was sold out for many of them. And we literally had we did a lot of our shows at what used to be the old Richard Hugo House Theater, at Center House Theater, at what is now Annex Theater. Pretty much every theater space in town we've been in. And we had to turn away sometimes as many people as we had in the house. And the people that came to support our shows were about 70% Asian American, about 10, 15% Black, Latinx, Native Americans, and then the rest are white, Caucasian Americans, and it was really diverse, and it's because we and a lot of our audience shared that they came to see our shows because they didn't see anything else like it, and especially people of color. They wanted to be in a space where they could laugh out loud. What we loved about our shows is that audience doesn't have to be proper and quiet and just kind of sit there and not laugh or not speak or react. We love the fact that in our shows, because it was huge diversity, and over the years we actually the number of Black and Latinx and Native American and immigrants kept on increasing, and it was really exciting. But it was because they felt like they could come to see our shows and they would actually talk back to our characters. Like we had people who my character would do something like decide to date this awful person. And the audience was like, no, Elizabeth, don't date him. He's an, can I say ass?
You can.
He's an ass, or whatever. They would talk back to our characters. Over the episodes, people felt like they were literally like with us every step of the way. And it got to the point where we would go to like movie theaters or the mall, and we had people stopping us. Like we had two characters who actually were dating other characters in the show. Two of the actors were dating other characters in the show, but they actually happened to be dating each other in real life. And they were at the mall one day, and they had some audience members come up to them and go, "Oh, you two are not supposed to be together."
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, and and I had a lot of experiences like that too. It's hilarious. And so, but that's what we were trying to do. That's how you actually make systems changes in ways that actually center people of color, and not in ways that have to meet white gaze expectations of what's always expected of us. Because if we did that, we would still be stuck. I would still be only playing roles where I was falling in love with white men and killing myself afterwards. And so this was our opportunity to be our own agents of change, create a show. And I will say that we had very diverse casts as well. One of our longtime favorite directors was a gay Black man. We had Black characters from the very beginning. We had a diverse and multiracial characters. We actually talked about what it means to be multiracial in the show, because several of the characters are multiracial. So we actually explored a lot of systemic issues, but did it through comedy. And did it through episodic structure in a way where our audience fans that followed us through those years. And I will say that theater critics of color completely got what we were doing. And their reviews were 180-degree different because they understood the humor we were going for. But yeah, that was one of the ways that I tried to like really use theater as a tool for change in shaping different people's perceptions. Oh, and just one more story I just want to share.
No, please go for it.
We had really designed that show for other Asian Americans like ourselves to be able to see something where they were reflected, but having other people of color be huge fans. I mean, we had a lot of Indigenous and Black people as our strongest fan base through the whole 20 years. I mean, they would actually like say, we've seen 6, like we'd have competitions to see who'd seen the most episodes. And it's because they said, like at that time, especially, they never got to see any people of color on stage. So at least seeing other people of color and stories that they completely related to, because while we have distinct different experiences in this country depending on race, people of color, because we have been placed in this huge monolith by white Americans as a whole, we do also have very similar experiences that are aligned with each other. And that's why they understood a lot of the humor we were doing as well. And then we had a huge immigrant following. We had a lot of first generation immigrants. And the reason why we asked them, like, because we went out to the audience after every show and welcomed everyone and thanked them for coming. And what they shared with us, the reason why they came is because they had come to this country. They were the only English they were taught was formal English in school. And they wanted to learn how to speak colloquial English, but everything that they saw on television, again, did not reflect their experiences or who they were. But by seeing our shows, they were able to find out about dating. They were able to find out about how you interact with other races. They were able to find out what the slang terms were, how to speak colloquial English, all of these different things. And so they loved it for that reason. It was their way to learn English in a way that was more reflective of their experience than watching standard American television.
Wow, what a great journey. I remember when SIS Productions first started. I remember starting to see all of the episodics, and I have to tell you, I was a young kid, but I was very skeptical. I was like, how is this going to work? How is this episodic going to make any sense? And are people going to come back and be a part of that? And then just to watch the success of it as it continued to grow and people being turned away and everything like that. And then also having the ability to just be able to be, right? To be able to just be yourselves and have those experiences without having to educate the audience, right? And just live there. What a great opportunity for everybody to be able to partake in. And I'm so glad that was continuing. Are you still doing it? Do you guys still get together and do a show, or?
No, we decided at some point, I think around episode 12, we were like, how long is this going on? I mean, because our very first episode, you're like, will anyone come? Will it just be creepy guys with raincoats? We did have one creepy guy with a raincoat and a hat in his lap. For the first episode, we were like, who is that? But majority of people who came, as I said, were young, 20-somethings to 30-somethings. And then we actually started getting a lot of senior women coming, like Golden Girl type women coming, women with, and a lot of them shared a lot of their stories with me, writer, which someday we might come back and do like a kind of like the Golden Girls episodes when we're a little bit older. But we had a lot of people come to the show, and around episode 12, we were like, how long should we keep this going? And we knew, like, we didn't, like in our original trajectory, there were a number of like storylines we knew how we wanted to play out. So we at least had to get to that point. But then as the episodes evolved, because we got a lot of feedback from our audience, we would often take audience input to evolve which direction stories would go. So sometimes the characters would surprise ourselves and go in a completely different direction, depending on chemistry of actors as well. But we decided that we did not want to go out like at a point where, oh, no one's coming anymore, we're not relevant anymore. We also realized because each episode was like maybe a week or a day in the life of, and the show ran for like 12 years. We were not getting any younger. So we either had to do a huge leap in time, or we decided to end when we were on top. So we decided when we hit episode 20, we would stop. So we did episode 20 in 2012 at West of Lenin. And it was pretty amazing because we had fans who had moved out of state and actually flew back to Seattle so that they could catch the last episode. It was really something else. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, with all the reboots and everything happening, maybe there's a Zoom, reboot version in the future for you in this new world that we're living in. You can bring it back. I want to talk to you really quickly about your career and some of the good and bad trends or habits that you've noticed about Seattle theater in general. Can you talk a little bit about that and just over your career? Let's start with the trends first of all. Just trends, good trends, bad trends, things that you've noticed as you've worked in this community. Yeah,
I'm gonna answer this question in this way. I mean, I could like do a whole like PhD thesis on different trends that have happened in Seattle over time. I grew up here. I've been involved with the theater scene for most of my entire life. And so I'll put it kind of at a very high level, and then I'll deep dive into some very specific points under that. So at a very high level, growing up here in Seattle, when I first got out of college and started doing shows, I will tell you that the reality here was we are still a very white city. I mean, for an urban center the size Seattle is, we're still called like one of the whitest cities in the country. And the reality was, even my high school teacher who cast me in everything, when I told her, I'm thinking about going into theater as a career, she actually said, Kathy, the reality is that real life is not like high school. First, as a woman, there's huge inequities in theater when it comes to just gender parity in terms of theater. But then add on top of that race, she said, the reality of you getting work and making a living is like next to nothing. And
Wow.
She really encouraged me that if I wanted to pursue theater, to maybe consider getting a teaching degree and teaching theater, that would be at least more feasible. And so I actually then decided not to go to theater. I'd actually gotten a scholarship to USC in their film school. And well, I hated LA, so that was a huge reason why I decided not to accept it. But I really thought long and hard about what she said, and I really respected her. And so I decided, okay, I'm not going to do that. And so ended up getting another scholarship and going to the University of Washington instead. But I couldn't resist going to that drama building and signing up for auditions. But in college, I was very lucky and got cast in a lot of roles. But then outside of college, other than what I jokingly called in casting workshops I have done, where as a person of color, we often only get cast in theaters if it was a educational touring show where they wanted to have one of everybody, or it was their holiday cash cow, where because they'd done it so many times, they were just looking for other actors who hadn't done it before to be in it. Or if maybe there was a play that they were doing that had a role that was specifically written for a person of color. Like those are the only times we were getting cast in any of the shows in town. But when I will say that was even later, I mean, even right when I got out of college, I would say that the majority of actors of color who wanted to make a career in acting, even part-time a career in acting, almost all of them moved away to New York or LA or Chicago, anywhere except for Seattle, because we just could not there were no theaters were doing any works written by people of color or even featuring roles with people of color. So except for that educational touring show or that holiday show, there was really no work for people of color as a whole. That was how bad it was back then. So I actually went into theater administration for a while and took a break from acting. And I remember there was I was trying to look up the name of the book, but I couldn't find it. It's probably out of print now. But there was this woman who came to Seattle. She was touring all the major cities around the United States that are known as theater towns to write up a book, a handbook on this is not the Seattle Actors Handbook, but this is a national one, on just opportunities in Seattle. And she had one whole segment for in each chapter for each city on what it would be like in terms of if you're an actor of color. And for Seattle, she literally wrote, this is the whitest theater town she's ever been in. And unlike New York and Chicago and LA at that time, who were already doing a lot of diversity casting, Seattle hadn't even started doing that yet. And she literally said in her book that if you're an actor of color, don't go to Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how bad it was when I was just coming out of college. And so I know right now, there's still a lot of inequities and a lot of actors complain, but believe it or not, because I've been here long enough, we actually have moved the needle. So that's great. But you know what it took to move that needle? It wasn't because all of a sudden theaters were like, hey, we should be casting a lot more actors of color and being much more racially equitable in our casting. It was actually because of the recession. There were two recessions, right? So
right.
In the early 2000s with the dot-com bust, that was really the first one where a lot of the big theaters that had always hired equity, and I will just actually say, I shouldn't just say it was only actors of color. In general, in Seattle at that time, all of the largest equity houses, if you were an actor in Seattle, it was hard to get work because at that time, a lot of the big houses cast pretty much like 70–80% of their cast were from New York City or a regional theater and not locally. And they had the budgets to support that at that time. But when that dot-com crash happened in the early 2000s, all of a sudden budgets were tight and theaters were like, oh my gosh, we can't afford to fly in these people, pay them huge rates, and house them. So in an effort to conserve their budgets, that was when they started going, oh, you know, maybe we should cast locally. And so when they started casting locally, then more actors in general started getting cast. And so it was sad that it took an economic downturn for that reality to happen. But that's also where I think right now, what's happening right now might also be another opportunity in a different way to really kind of open up the lenses of what might be possible in theater. So anyway, the reality is that, so one of the, I guess it's I don't know if you'd call it a trend, but our theaters have been getting more diverse. There was another turning point I want to mention, and a lot of it is because if anyone's ever read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, or taken one of the workshops, and you know, our office, I actually commissioned her to develop that workshop on white fragility and brought her back to Seattle to present it for our office originally. One thing she talks about is, you know, we all, those of us who are born and raised here, or anyone who comes and immigrates here quickly finds out, like, our country is really steeped in the waters of, and I know some people are gonna have strong reactions to this word, but it's true. The culture of this society is really steeped in white supremacy culture. And I know when people think of white supremacy, they automatically think KKK and neo-Nazis and all that stuff. And while they're definitely the extreme version of white supremacy, the reality is if you just look up the definition of what white supremacy is, it means basically where white people are at the top of the hierarchy, where the culture of white people is what is centered and what is prevalent and taken for granted that that is the norm. So anything that is not a part of white culture is always seen as other or less than. And so because of that centering of white supremacy culture in our entire culture, in every industry, of course, theater, which is a reflection of life, is going to reflect that as well. And so it's mind-boggling to me, but you know, a lot of theaters with best intentions, because I honestly think theater makers, arts administrators who go into theater artists, we could be doing any other profession and be making so much more money doing it. So the fact that we're doing theater means that we're doing it because we really believe in the power of theater to transform lives, in the fact that theater can make a difference in people's lives. So a lot of theater makers are not bad people at all. They just are brought up in this white supremacy culture. So most of the theaters in town really honestly thought, like, we're here for everybody. We put out these casting calls and say, we want everybody to audition. And they don't understand why most of the people who are auditioning are mostly white, and why the directors are still casting mostly white people, and why the plays are mostly written by white people, and why their audiences are still mostly white. And it's because people of color growing up, we've been shown that we're invisible on your stages. We're invisible, period, unless it's some awful stereotype on television. And so why would we put our lives on the line to come into spaces where we've never seen ourselves reflected? So it takes a lot of courage to flip that, right? And so in the where I saw the biggest advance in Seattle was in 2014. There was an incident that really blew up in the national media, not locally, but in the national media, around yellowface. One local organization did a production of The Mikado, and they all did yellowface, where they made themselves up to look Asian, but none of them were. And it really blew up nationally. It was interesting that Seattle media didn't really cover it. But CNN, national news media sources, they were all contacting Seattle about it. There was a lot of heated divisiveness in our community about it. So many people that I was like, I thought you were very open-minded, were saying things like, oh, you Asians are just so sensitive. What's wrong with, theater artists are meant to play any kind of role. Not realizing that these were just awful depictions of that make people think that this is how Asians are supposed to be. And so when that happened, I immediately went to my director and said, I think we need to have a conversation about race in our community. And luckily I have a director who's a very green light director who gives us a lot of freedom to do things. And so he said, okay, sure. And so I very quickly put together this forum to talk about race and representation in Seattle theater. We thought we might get 50 people. So we had originally scheduled it at the Seattle Repertory Theater in the small poncho space. Then registration started coming in, and you realize, like, from the day that I went to my director to the day that we did it was less than 3 weeks.
Wow.
The first week when registration started coming in, we realized, oh, we're gonna have to move to the Leo K. And then we ended up having like over 400 people register, and we had to move it to the large space. And then we had two, different television stations like streaming it. So it was huge. And what I did was I curated this conversation representative of a multitude of voices in the audience and on stage to really talk about race. And so many people said after that experience that it was the first time that our city had actually, in theater especially, had actually had an open conversation about race in such a public way. What was amazing to me was it showed what a huge divide there was, though, because so many white theater people, after they attended, contacted me, emailed me, reached out to me, called me, and said, oh my gosh, Kathy, it was amazing to experience it, but I feel like I was pushed against a wall. Like, we didn't realize that people felt this way, that they didn't think that we were being inclusive, that they felt we were, being exclusive, that we were like, and they really wanted guidance in terms of what they could do to change that perception, because that wasn't their intent. But of course, intent is never the same as impact. Artists of color, on the other hand, were like, we need radical change now. And I will be the first to admit, like, if I was to redo that, I think I would have done it differently. I did want to have a space where we do, like, there's this really great grant maker in the country called Justin Lang, and he calls it reading the temperature of the room. And it's a strategy that a lot of us people of color working in predominantly white institutions use, which is we try to push as far as we can on that edge where we can definitely feel the tension. We're definitely pushing the line of how we move forward. But because we're pushing it against white systemic structural racism, it's tiring, exhausting, challenging work where we have to do a lot of code switching and doing what we can to be able to keep that ball moving without it having to roll all the way back down the hill and have to start over again. So we're pushing that line of tension. The reason why the reason why I'm getting emotional right now is because the reason why it's so challenging to be in those positions is because we're trying to push as hard as we can to get the majority of our country, white people, to change, and we get so much pushback, but we can't push them so hard that they put up a wall, and like I said, we roll back down to the bottom of the mountain. And at the same time, because especially those of us who are put in positions of leadership, a lot of people of color are like, you're not doing enough. We need to do more. Like, we need to just call out the racism and do that. And the reason why it's so hard to be in that position, and I'm just speaking from my own experience, but I know this, I have a lot of conversations with people all around the country, like Carmen Morgan and other people. is because we know that in doing that and just pushing that, being on the leading edge of that tension and trying to push as far as we can, but not like push so hard, is because we know that when we do that, we're actually betraying other people of color, because we're not pushing hard enough. We're not making the justice that needs to happen now. And I just share that because I think a lot of people don't realize how challenging it is to create systemic change in our society. But that is why right now, when I see all the protests and the calling out of white supremacy culture and the support for Black Lives Matter, well, it's giving me so much hope, because we need that kind of collective momentum from people of all races in order to truly make change. When it first started happening, I will admit that even me, one of the most positive people most people know, couldn't help but be a little bit cynical, because when Charlene Lyles was murdered 3 years ago, when the Charleston 9 happened 5 years ago, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, when so many people been murdered before, and in our circles at least, we had seen people like take a day and reflect on it and cry, and we had so many white allies and other people say, commiserate. But then, a few weeks later, everything was back to normal. And I think, if anything, this pandemic and what's happening right now shows us is we cannot go back to normal. But just know that it is a really huge work, and it will take all of us working together to make that change. So I know that was a really, really deep dive, and I didn't even get to all the points that I really want to make in terms of trends, good and bad. But I think it's so important to talk about that higher level, bigger picture. I do want to specify that I think the diversity of casting that's been happening, the diversifying of playwrights' voices that has been happening, even the diversifying of lead staff, like, at Village Theater and Sound Theater, and that's great. But one of the things I definitely want to point out, because sometimes this never gets brought up and it's so important, we have a huge number of people of color-led theater organizations in our community that have been here for decades. Hansberry Project, SA Teatro, Porkfield Productions, React Theater, New Black ArtsWest, Red Eagle Soaring, Pratidhwani. I mean, there's so many. I can't even list them. Latino theater projects. So many of these theaters who have long been doing work that is vital, that is vibrant, that is important, and doing it without any paid staff, with very little support. So I think this is one of the things I just want to put front and center. I love the fact that more and more theaters are becoming more diverse and offering more opportunities and paid opportunities for artists of color. We need that. That cannot stop. And it has to actually increase even more, especially putting people of color in decision-making roles. But at the same time, we need to make sure that those theaters, the people of color-led theaters, BIPOC-led theaters that have been around for a long time doing the hard work, giving BIPOC artists their first experiences in designing and acting and directing and playwriting, workshopping those plays that then get picked up by a big theater, and then the big theater gets the recognition for it, and the small BIPOC theater doesn't get anything. We need to figure out a way that we can actually center those theaters. I know some people say, oh, but the quality doesn't seem as high. Well, I actually have to call out, in a good way, positive way, Michael Strangeways with Seattle Gay News, which I hope someone will save that paper. But he actually, in one review, actually wrote, like, some people may go see this production by this BIPOC theater and may find like, oh, the set production values are kind of low, but realize, and he called it out, where they probably did not get as many donations or grant funds or people supporting them. And so they're having to do huge amount of work to even make this production happen. And he really laid out the inequity in our theater systems, and especially in the funding world. And I speak as a funder, especially in the funding world, where a lot of the larger institutions, as they diversify, a lot of funders like, oh, look at this theater, they're doing something new and different. So nationally and locally, they're getting huge grants to do that different thing. Whereas the small theater companies, like an SA Teatro, might get a tiny grant because they're doing what they've always done. It doesn't seem as revolutionary. And yet the resilience of having been able to survive as a small company without monetary support, that is huge, and that should be rewarded through donations and through support. So I want to make sure we do that. And this is something I've struggled for a long time to figure out how to say this, so I'm going to say it. I want, and again, as an individual artist, I want artists of color to be paid for their work and be paid far more than any of us are getting now. They deserve that. We deserve that. So that's why I've always been so thrilled when, like a conversation I had with Lauren Yee, who is huge now, but her first play done in Seattle was one that SIS Productions did in 2010, and it sold out. But we introduced her scripts to ACT Theater and other theaters locally, and so like when she had her new script, King of the Yees, I'd seen the workshops of it. I reached out to her immediately and said, we would love to do this show, but I also don't want to. But I also know that probably every large theater in town will want to do your show. So what I want to offer to you, and I've offered this to my friend Kimberly, who's one of the nationally renowned playwrights, where I want to support you in doing your show in whatever way that means, even if it means like me going out to the larger theaters who can pay you full royalties at the rate you deserve, and more importantly, give you the recognition, the prestige, whatever, in, again, white supremacy culture values of that you need. I'm willing to do that because I mostly want to make sure that as many people can see this play as possible. And I know, like SIS Productions, we're not going to get the media coverage. We're not going to be able to get the grants. We're not going to be able to have enough staff capacity to be able to reach as far as like an ACT can. And so I know that, and this is true of Hansberry Project and Porkfield Productions, all of us lose out. We lose our playwrights to the big theaters, which they deserve to have that recognition, right? But somehow there's an inequity in the system when this happens continually. We often, when casting, we end up having to wait until the large theaters do their diverse casting first because we want all of our actors of color to get those equity paychecks that we can't afford because we're not getting the grants or the resources. But at the same time, that means that we often get, like, we are always developing new talent, which I huge value, and I love doing that. But that's also why when people come to see our shows, they're like, well, that actor didn't seem like they were quite polished yet, the review will say kindly. Not knowing that part of our existence, reason for being, is to help develop that talent, which unfortunately then goes to the bigger theaters once they actually get enough experience. So this is the one small ask I ask of artists of color. If you've gotten experience, if you've gotten a chance to work at some of the BIPOC run theaters in town, at the very least, make sure that when the white large companies edit your bios, that they don't erase our existence in your bios. We know it sounds so much more impressive to say that you've worked at the Rep and Intiman and Fifth Avenue Theater and Village Theater, and so oftentimes all the experience that they've done in our theaters gets completely erased. Sometimes it's the artist wanting to put their best bio forward. And lots of times I know it's because the theater company is editing down those bios and takes out some of our names because we don't have the same recognition. That is just like the smallest ask, but it's about same thing as with land acknowledgements, which I did want to find space to acknowledge. We are on the indigenous lands of the Coast Salish people. And even though lots of times acknowledgements can seem very performative, I think the reason why it's important to still make an effort to call out the people who have cared for this land for 10,000 years before we were here is because it's an act of resistance against the erasure of people, of human beings. And so I have actually a whole long list of small asks that would make theater even begin to take the first steps much more equitable. And I have presented them in different workshops for different people. And unfortunately, I've not seen as much movement on some of those. And some of them are very, very tiny. But at least do not erase us from those, the recognitions in bios as a very starting place. Okay, sorry, that was a huge deep dive.
No, that was great. That was great. Thank you. Thank you.
Monologue.
No, but thank you for sharing your heart and for sharing your thoughts. I mean, and everything you said, we will dive into it a little bit deeper later on, because I do have a section where I want to hear that wish list for sure. But you bring up, and I just want to move along a little bit here so we can get to some questions. For those of you who are just joining us, I know we've had a couple people dive in. If you have questions for Kathy, we will be doing a Q&A at the end of this hour, or at the end of our time here tonight. So please put it in the YouTube comments or in the live stream on Facebook, and I will get to them as I can. Kathy, you've talked a lot about the grants and the work and the things that you do. And you, as I mentioned in your bio, you are the Cultural Partnerships and Grant Manager for Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. And you've driven so much great cultural change, and you helped the agency earn the Seattle Management Association's first Race and Social Justice Management Award in 2007. I don't know, you've given so much of your heart. I don't know that this question is really relevant anymore in terms of why this work is so meaningful to you, because you've given so many great examples about seeing yourself seeing people like you on stage and having a voice and representing those folks. So I want to move past that question, unless you have something you want to add.
I would like to
absolutely, please go.
The reason why this work is so meaningful is, again, I am American of Chinese ancestry, and the Chinese, growing up on, this just sounds so kind of, family values are very important. So our ancestors, where we come from, our roots are a huge part of our culture. So when I talk about why, like, where did I get the seed of like trying to make the world a better place? Though I do think all theater artists, to extent, especially arts administrators, that is part of our DNA. But I like to just pay homage to my parents and my grandparents as quickly as I can in this. My dad is someone who always stood up when he saw inequities happen. And just as a quick example, he came to America to get his PhD in engineering in Utah. But in Utah, he quickly realized in trying to get jobs that unless you're Mormon, you don't get benefits because it's the church that actually covers benefits, not the state. And he was a civil engineer. So he came to Seattle because there was a huge calling nationwide. They were looking for more civil engineers. So he went to Seattle to get a job, and that's how he ended up here when I was like 2. And when he applied, like, they were looking for all these engineers. So they did a whole hiring process. And then when he didn't get hired, he did some research, and he found out that, in fact, the only 2 people who didn't get hired in that round of hiring were the 2 Asian guys.
Wow.
So then he started researching and found out that pretty much the whole city of Seattle workforce, especially in the engineering department, were all white. And so then he did some more research, and he found out the reason why was because there was an ancient law that actually said that in order to work for the city of Seattle, you had to take a civil service test. And the civil service test required that you had to be an American citizen. And it was even more specific than that, but I can't remember the exact legality of it. But he thought, like, this is like, and this is like a law that was from like the 1800s, I think. And so he was like, this seems like not right at all. And so he actually sued the city of Seattle and had a landmark case that he won. And it was what changed the laws in Seattle, so that that ancient law was was gotten rid of, and now for the first time, immigrants were able to actually apply for jobs and be hired on the qualifications. Because the thing that he found out was not only were the two Asian guys the ones who did not get hired, but both he and the other gentleman had PhDs and masters in engineering, and everyone else actually had lower educational qualifications. So anyway, so that has been in my DNA, is him. And my grandparents. I mean, my grandfather was born when China still had an emperor. And he was a young boy when it became a republic. And then he was a man in like leading a whole education department, basically. He was like basically a minister of education for a third party in China, not the nationalists, not the communists, but a third party, and had to flee when the communists took over. And, you know, my cousins and I have been doing this long research project to kind of delve into more of my grandparents' history. My grandfather and grandmother at one point during World War II, when, you know, the Japanese were attacking China and there was internal strife between the communists and the nationalists, they were running like this newspaper. And because my grandfather was so involved in the politics of that time, my grandmother ended up having to kind of run the newspaper by herself. And it was dangerous to be a journalist. It still is dangerous to be a journalist during wartime. And she had to run it and like have a whole, like my grandmother had 7 kids. There were only 5 at that point, but you know, just these cataclysmic events that they endured and survived and managed to get to a new country. And so I come from genes that I feel like I have to pay homage to because of standing up for what you believe in. But the specific story that I do want to share is because I know a lot of people go, you know, it's both painful and it's bittersweet, right? Right now, so many people are all of a sudden aware of the huge racial inequities that Black people have had to experience in our country. I mean, I think everyone knows it on some kind of intellectual level. You know, most people in this country do know that slavery did happen and the impacts of that, but I don't think people understood the systemic racism that evolved from slavery and the supposed emancipation that happened, where because of white guilt, it actually created unintentional racist like policies, right? It created a systems and structures in our country that actually, it was almost a way of, that was a really bad episode in our country. We don't even want to deal with that, so we're never going to deal with that. And it left, it never created systems for how do we heal from the impacts of slavery. There is I can't remember her new married name, but Dr. Joy O'Leary, she actually had, and I might be remembering her name wrong, I'm so sorry. There's a book that is about post-traumatic slave syndrome, where all of the residual effects of slavery we're still dealing with now. We've not dealt with. Right now, it feels like we're finally opening up to possibly doing that, like, oh, let's admit that this happened, and how do we deal with it? We might start to be having a glimmer of that. But so now it feels like more people are finally, it's hitting home in their heart, not just some intellectual awareness of it, but actually hitting home in their heart. not to the extent that it needs to be, and we need a lot more to show that it actually means something beyond, you know, a few months. But the story I want to share, because I think a lot of people go, you know, Kathy, you've always done a lot of work in this realm, and you know, and I think and I already shared the Book It story of that impact that it had.
Mm-hmm.
But from growing up in elementary school, I knew at a very young age, like here in Seattle, like a lot of the guys in class, the Black and brown guys in class, were always being sent out into the hallway. But I never understood why. And they were told it was because of their behavior, but I couldn't figure out what they'd done that was any different than anybody else, other than being maybe, you know, being more energetic about some things, but it was not anything that should be sent out in the hall for or expelled from school for. So you already see that as young kids, we already see that inequity play out. But the truly transformative points in my life are, and I'll keep this short because I've shared this in other circles in writing, and with young women in particular. Every single time my life has been in life and death danger. When I was 14, I was literally dragged off the street by an older white man, where he was basically kidnapping me. I mean, he literally came up and grabbed me and was dragging me away. I saw it was between North Downtown and Belltown. I was going to my junior achievement meeting presentation, and so most businesses were closed at that hour because it was like 6:30. But there was one business that I saw, a storefront, where it was maybe a law office or an accounting firm. There were like maybe 6 people working in that office. And I saw that he was dragging me down the sidewalk, and I pulled at the door, and luckily it was open. So I ran in and I said, "Call 911, help." And they all stood up and looked and stared. And the man just said, "Oh, don't worry, she's my girlfriend. We're just having a lover spat." And he dragged me back out. And I remember when he dragged me back out, I thought, "Oh my God, I'm dead now." I remembered looking back through that window and seeing they were all white. They looked like very nice people, but they were all just staring, and not a single one of them was picking up a phone, making a call, running to try to do something. They all just stood there and did nothing. And I thought, I'm dead. But luckily, as he was dragging me around the corner, this Metro bus pulled up and was driving down. There was no bus stop there. And the bus driver stopped the car, slammed on his brakes, opened the door. I ran in, and the bus driver shut the door on the man's arm and started driving. And the man had to let go, otherwise he was going to get dragged by the bus. And the bus driver was Black. And he saw what was happening and knew that I was in trouble and stopped immediately. And that's just one example of actually many in my life where the people who have always saved me have been Black people, both Black men and Black women, whether I've been stranded in a car that I was trying to move by myself, and even Asian people would drive by and not stop and help, and white people all drove by and wouldn't stop and help. But it was always Black people would stop and help me. And I think it is because they know what it's like when no one will help them. They know what it's like for people turn their backs and go, my time is worth more than your life. So I don't want to get involved. I don't want to help. I'm too busy. I'm going to an appointment, so I'm not going to stop and help. But Black people know what it's like to be in a position where everyone does that to them. And so I believe that every single time that I've needed help, it's always been Black people who have been there. They know the signs, they see it, and they have been supportive of that. And so for me, it is a deep personal, we are in this together. We are in this together. And so that's why it's so deeply personal to me.
I'm speechless. I thank you for sharing your story and for your heart. I don't even know what to say out of that. And it's so clear that it resonates within you, and it is a calling for you. And I'm so incredibly grateful for the work that you do. And gosh, I wish we could all do the work that you do and be better at it. So thank you for sharing that. Speaking of the work that you do, Kathy, you created a continuum that you adopted from the Crossroad Ministry for the Racial Equity Arts Lab, or REAL Forum. For those who don't know what this is a great document that helps organizations examine their own systemic biases and inclusion practices. Talk to me about what it was like putting this together and the conversations that have come from this document.
Yeah. Well, with our office, when I was put in the position I am now, which is managing our grant funding programs, I knew that I wanted to kind of flip what grant funding is in our society. And how can I put this simply? I did not want to simply fund diversity. I was seeing that a lot of other places that were more progressive were starting to fund diversity, which is great. I mean, it's important. Diversity isn't, don't get me wrong, like that's the first step and it needs to happen, but that can't be the only step. And what I mean by funding diversity is that, more funders were starting to fund a more diverse pool of artists, of projects, sometimes led by people of color, oftentimes not. And that's so important, but it can't just end there. So what I want to do is, how do we make grant making, how do we use it as a tool to actually inspire the will of our arts and cultural sector to become more anti-racist, to actually change the systems that keep making things inequitable. And so I, and there's way too many, there's so much masterminding and work with community and doing listening sessions and putting together think tanks with people of color and checking back in and listening. And but I will say that the first step I took when I first came into the office in a different position was really, I asked my boss if the first thing I could do was actually just spend time going out in community and meeting with immigrant communities, refugee communities, organizations led by people of color, BIPOC artists, and just spend time listening to them and finding out what their needs were, what they needed funding for, what they thought were perceived barriers to getting funding, and what we could do better. And from all of that input, all of these ideas that I have ever enacted comes from taking all of that listening, putting it into my brain, and doing a lot of deep reflection, and then doing a lot of checking back and forth with the same communities, the ones who are most impacted by systemic racism. So there's a lot of stuff that I can't even get to in like a lifetime to talk about. But in terms of this specific tool, I knew that. So the first thing I did, the first meeting I actually had when I got put into the position of being grants manager for the office was I set up a meeting with all of the biggest predominantly white institutions. We're talking the big ones, and met with them. I was fortunate my director was willing to come with me. And we basically had the meeting and said, we're going to be cutting your funding for the next however many years, because you've funded too much money. And the only way, because you have to realize I stepped in my position right after there was the 2008 recession, right, which hit Seattle most strongly in 2010. I stepped into my position in 2011 after our funding budget had been slashed almost $1 million. And the first thing I went to these organizations and said, the predominantly white institutions, was, we're going to be cutting your funding even more because I don't have any more funding. But I need to move the funding that we've been giving you and spread it out more equitably to BIPOC, people of color-led, centered organizations. And the only way to do that is to shift the funding. But I was also cognizant if I couldn't do that in one fell swoop, because I'd seen other cities that did that, tried that with like one program, not all of their funding, but with one program. And there was so much divisiveness that it actually created, it did not create, collective community in terms of solidarity and how we work together as an arts community. What it did was it actually divided the arts community, where all the predominantly white institutions really felt like it was reverse discrimination, and it politically became a mess, and it was really not a pretty picture at all. And the reality is, it took 400 years for the systemic racism to come to place. We can't change it overnight. But again, this is part of that feeling like I'm betraying my community by not flipping it over in one night. But I knew that the only way that I was going to be able to do this successfully is as I was moving money over and shifting it to rebalance everything, I had to help white institutions understand why they needed to do this so that they would be willing to do it of their own accord. And so that's when the training started. We did this whole, all these racial equity learning cohorts, and we needed a tool for that. So we used Crossroad Ministries tool, but the feedback we got from all the participants, which are all arts organization, artistic directors and leaders, and managing directors and education directors, was that it felt like it was really geared for nonprofits. So they didn't really see as much alignment with arts organizations. And then, so I adapted it so it would be more fitting to arts organizations. But over the last few years, what I've been doing is, because we fund so many more BIPOC organizations now than when we did when I first stepped in. As an example, back then, only 8% of who applied to us were BIPOC organizations. Now, in the organizational funding program, now it's like 18%, but across, or 19%, but across all of our programs, actually, now we're getting closer to 50-50 on who we fund and where the dollars are going. But the tool was it was created by Crossroads Ministries, really geared for white institutions to address their own anti-racism, but it didn't really address the fact that there's also a lot of racism between races. Like in my own Asian American communities, there is a lot of anti-Blackness at play, and we need to work on that as a whole community. So I've been adapting and evolving it over time to be much more holistic, much more humanistic. So a lot of this spectrum now, like the bullet points are, I would say, like the majority of them are from, again, things that I've heard deeply from in community, a combination of everything that I've read, studied, researched. I've been so fortunate to have been able to take trainings with like John Powell and Carmen Morgan and Shakti Butler and Robin DiAngelo and some of the Rinka Sen and some of the leading thought people around racial equity. And so this is kind of accumulation of a lot of people's ideas, but filtered through the tangible work that our office and a lot of the people I work with and myself have done. So it's in my language, but it's gathered from so many different resources. And it was really created as a tool so that people could kind of see, because everyone's always looking for like, I don't even understand what you're talking about. And so it's a spectrum on like, do you really want to be an exclusionary, white organization, or do you want to be inclusive and honor the full spectrum of everyone's humanity, where people across all races are able to be in a room and be creative and live up to their full potential, because we all feel valued and seen and heard for who we are. Where we don't have to code switch, where we don't have to pretend, where we don't have to play some game of how do we fit in, because, white supremacy culture is over here and I feel so far away from that. I feel like I'm an imposter, or I feel like there's a lot of racialized gaslighting that happens in our country, where it forces people of color to question ourselves constantly, wondering if we're good enough, especially in theater, oh my God. Like we start questioning, like, did I not get cast because of my race or my talent or myself? Like we never know. So we're always questioning, and that kind of, the trauma in emotional turmoil that continues to generate when we're dealing with it time after time, and we haven't even talked about like the microaggressions and the racism that we experience, but just that own internalized trauma of what we go through because of these hugely racist systems that we live in and the culture that we live in, it eats away at us. And I am talking about, like, from my experience as an Asian American person, for anyone in this country who is Black, that it's exponentially worse because of the anti-racism, because of the residual effect of white guilt over slavery, or white like abandonment of even wanting to deal with reparations and healing around slavery. It's so much worse. So I want to actually just say one thing. One thing that I really hearing a lot right now is that I know a lot of white people feel a lot of discomfort in what they're hearing and experiencing now. But is that discomfort? Just imagine, like, discomfort is so. I mean, I completely honor and feel for anyone when they feel uncomfortable or hurting, but that discomfort is so minute compared to the daily lived trauma of people of color, and especially Black people, where one gentleman that I worked with and hugely respect is a Black man. He actually shared with me after one racial equity training that, do you know what it takes to get up every morning and leave the house? Like, how do I brace myself to be able to leave the house knowing everything that I'm going to have to encounter and steel myself up for? Like, that is the experience of the African American community their entire lives in our country. And so is that little bit of discomfort so big a price to pay for someone else's humanity? And we are really, when we're talking about Black lives, we're talking life and death humanity, not just experience. As an Asian American woman, yes, my humanity gets impacted, but as a Black person in this country, it's literally life and death.
You talk about the uncomfortability and the guilt of that, and you have often been quoted as saying, "Don't live in the guilt. Guilt immobilizes you." So I wonder if you could talk more about that statement and what that specifically means when it comes to the matters of race, of allyship, of activism in general.
Yeah, I usually say that because in different trainings that I've done is lots of times, and don't get me wrong, I mean, we live in a culture that is steeped in guilt, all of us. But guilt is one of those emotions. Guilt, like worry, to me, are two emotions. While completely valid, they're part of being human, and we have to acknowledge that they are human emotions. But what we can't do is spend so much time in those spaces, because those spaces do keep us from being active and moving forward and changing what needs to be changed. And so the way guilt often plays out is white guilt is one where, especially when people, again, people with the best intentions, because they want to help, they want to make a difference, and they're floored when they hear like someone that they've worked with on many shows with, and they finally hear like, oh my gosh, like, they didn't realize the impact that they were having on another person. And then they feel so guilty. But then when a white person feels guilty with a person of color, what ends up always happening is they can't get beyond the guilt to actually do something different sometimes. So you just have to move through that guilt much faster. But more importantly, what ends up happening is that white guilt forces us people of color to then have to do what's called white comfort. And then we end up having to comfort you and make you feel better and try to not make you feel guilty or to lessen your guilt. And then it ends up, and I know fully it's not your intention, but then it ends up, I'm doing all the work to comfort you. And yet it was because you felt guilty that I said that something you did felt like a microaggression to me. So, but it ended up again being centered on the white person. And that always happens all the time. So what is happening right now, where there's this huge new awakening from so many more people than ever before, where people are actually being open about it. Like when Shalina Lyles happened, or when the Charleston 9 happened, I had a lot of white ally friends come to me and tell me in confidence, one-on-one, like we would be in a meeting together, and I would say something about inequity or, you know, stand up for something, and this room would be silent and no one would say anything. And then afterwards, they would come to me and say, oh, I was really, I was so behind you. I love what you said. And I'm like, why didn't you say that in the room? Because that's when I needed your allyship, not one-on-one in private. Now we are finally seeing more white allies actually in public showing their support, and that's definitely a step forward. But the reality is that we need so much more. We need to not be immobilized and not just be centered on where your awakening is, but a lot of what I've been experiencing, a lot of my Black friends and Latinx friends and Native American friends are experiencing is as white people are gaining a new awakening, they're asking for truth, and those of us who don't mind taking the time to share the truth, then there's always a period of, oh my God, and again, we know that it comes from a good place, but the impact can be really hard, and especially for my Black friends right now, they're getting so much of the brunt of this, that it is literally exhausting on top of everything else that they are trying to do. And so just be aware of how the white experience continually gets centered, even when more and more white people are trying to center Black voices during this time.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Gosh, we could spend literally 3 hours talking, because you have so many amazing stories and so many powerful things to say. In the interest of time, I am just going to move along a little bit here, just because we're coming up on that hour and a half, and folks have stuck with us this whole time. If you have questions for Kathy, we're going to get to the question and answer period in just a moment. So please put those in the comments, and we'll get to those in just a second. But Kathy, as a fixture of this theater scene, and you, as you mentioned, you've been around, you've worked in all of these different places, you've seen the things that you've mentioned, which are economic downturns, the theater's dying, spaces disappearing. Now you add COVID-19 into the mix, and then this coupled with the absolute need for systemic change in how race is not only represented, but celebrated in our theaters. With all of that in mind, what, if anything, do you see as a path forward for theaters to continue producing art? This would be, you had mentioned that you have that wish list, small little things that theaters could do to make a difference now. Share those thoughts with us. What do you see as the path forward with all of these things that are going on?
Well, this is so funny.
A small question, I know. Please solve everything in the next 2 minutes.
Where you had sent this question to me beforehand, I was just like, oh, I don't know that anyone can answer this question. So I am not an expert. No one is an expert in any of these things. So what I'm going to share are just ways of moving through this world, and it's not going to answer this question at all by any means, because we are,
it's a big question. It's a big question.
So the things I was thinking about, and this isn't even a wish list, because I have so many, I have so many scraps. I have so many notebooks where I'm a writer, so I write a lot. Typing doesn't do the same. I have to use paper and pen. And I'm a huge environmentalist, but paper and pen I still need. So I have tons and tons of notebooks. Someday, when I finally have more time, and everyone who knows me will laugh at that, I will get these transcribed and actually be able to share them more holistically. So what I did was, it's not so much a wish list, it's just some random thoughts that I want to make sure people took away. So one random thought, and this doesn't even answer the question at all. Sorry, I kind of like
that's okay.
I'm going to intentionally be a revolutionary, not answer.
You work in government, so I'm sure you're skilled in this. Just pivoting away.
is that BIPOC people are not a monolith. Black people are not all the same. Asian Americans are not all the same. Native American. All too often, we all get lumped into this big, broad category of we're people of color, we're Lana people, which is a term that some people, I think more on the East Coast use. We're we're BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, to really center front and center where the greatest disparities in every kind of everything in this country is. And so they often lump us together. So I'll often be in meetings with people. Oh, we cast diversely, and I'm looking at the cast and going, it still looks pretty white to me. And they go, no, we have a couple of people of color, and people consider that casting diversely. No, casting diversely would be where you have, you actually have 80% of if you were truly casting diversely, 80% of your casts should be people of color, because you should have representation from as many Black people, as Asian Americans, as Native Americans, as Latina actors, as white actors, right? Casting diversity doesn't mean majority white cast with a few people of color sprinkled in, which is, whenever I say that term, I always think of Raisins in a Glass of Milk, which is a company in town, because it is that image of just a few little, brown, dark things floating in this glass of milk. But the reality is if you were truly casting diversely, it should be 80% people of color as a whole, because of really each race is unique and different. But even beyond that, when I say that we're not a monolith, so many times people will think oh, Kathy, I want your opinion on this. And I realized, oh my gosh, then I realized why they were asking for it. And now I've stopped doing that as much, which is people will go we're thinking of casting this way, do you think this is okay? And then if I said, if I kind of go through a whole bunch of things with them to help them understand. So I'll almost never give a direct answer to that, because things like that you can't give a direct answer to. They have to be things that people took time reflecting on and thinking about. And the reality is that what I realized what people were doing was they would then go back to their board, or when an artist of color would challenge a decision that they'd made, they go, oh, well, Kathy said it was okay, so it must be okay. Wow. And again, best of intentions, but I don't think they realize how it plays out. But the subconscious psyche of that is that it kind of makes it feel like I'm supposed to represent every single Asian American person, or every single person of color, not just every Asian American, every single person of color. I cannot represent people anyone else other than myself. And you would never ask one white person to validate something and say, oh, it's okay because, so I guess just be careful of that lots of times people of color as a whole get all lumped together, and we're not. And even within each individual race, we're always lumped together, and we're not, which leads to tokenization. A lot of people don't understand that in their efforts to diversify, and again, I'm not saying don't diversify, you need to diversify and you need to go even further. But in an effort to do that, sometimes it can be tokenizing. And what do I mean by tokenizing? I mean that sometimes we do feel like the only reason that we were called in for certain things is because of our race. Not because you've come to see a show that we've been in, not because you think that we would be great for this part, because, I tend to be a very vivacious person, or like I said, I do drama roles really good because I'm really in touch with my feelings emotionally. And a lot of people will, they'll call me in for a role where I'm like, like I'm an actor, so I can play a wide range of roles, but there are certain roles like this is not me. Like I am not like skinny, athletic, muscle-bound women who can do like flying leaps, and that is not. And so, and that's an extreme exaggeration, but lots of times we get called in for roles where it really feels like the only reason I'm called in is because you wanted an Asian woman or a person of color to read for this role. And that's why I'm being called in. And that can feel tokenizing, or especially like boards of theaters, right? Where someone is, that they are invited to be on the board, not because they happen to be a lawyer or they're an expert accountant or because they have huge experience in whatever thing, but just because they happen to be Black or Asian. And after a while, you really do feel that sense, because they never ask you about the things that you actually know about. Every question that they always ask you is like, they'll ask the whole board, like, what do you think about this policy that we're going to instill, or about what do we do about raising, this in theater? And then they go, and then there's some racial issue. And then that's when they turn to you and ask for your expertise. That is tokenizing. People don't do that with white people. And so it's about, how do we, it's really, really realizing that we are each unique individuals, and how you think of unique individuals is how you should treat us as unique individuals. Sometimes something will happen where somewhat like another person of color will say, like, I did not feel comfortable dealing with that. And they'll tell that to a white person. And then the white person will then assume every single person of color does not feel comfortable with that. That is not true. And again, we know right now it's because you're concerned and you want to make sure that you're holding all of us in your care. And I so appreciate that intention. But it does then make us feel like you're just kind of looking at us all the same, as opposed to realizing that we're each unique individuals, and you just need to spend more time listening and being with us to know that. I'm trying to prioritize which ones to do the highest. Really, if there's one thing I can say, and it really is a catch-all for everything when it comes down to it, it's really leaning into love and grace and compassion, and really valuing people as human beings, rather than being trapped by fear or hate or judgment. And I know that's really simplistic, and I could do a million workshops just on how that shows up in so many different ways in theater and in the world. But when we start feeling ourselves get scared of something, I should have said this at the beginning. Like, the reason why I went into theater was because actually really did go into theater was because it was the scariest thing that I could have ever think to do. And throughout my life, that's been something that I tend to lean into the things that scare me, so that I can feel the agency of realizing that I can survive through that. But a lot of people, when they get scared by something, it actually shuts them down and they close off into themselves. And we're never going to be able to heal the racial injustices of the world if we all closed off and become self-centered. What we need to do is actually open ourselves up and be willing to live through a lot of discomfort in order to really connect with other people, because the only way we're going to be able to address all of this is it has to be collectively, it has to be in solidarity, it has to be supporting each other, and that is the only way that we're going to be able to do this. Otherwise, it becomes, I told you I talk in heralds. Otherwise, it becomes like Animal Farm, where in Animal Farm, there was the hierarchy, and then when they overthrew the hierarchy, it just became a different hierarchy of different animals that were at the top. Instead of, how do we create a system that, again, goes back to the indigenous roots of our land, where we are a village together. Every single person has a talent that they were born with, and how we sustain the village is allowing each person to be able to thrive to their fullest being in sharing their talent with each other. And the offering of my talent in exchange for me being able to appreciate and experience your talent is how we are able to hold each other up as a village and care for each other holistically. And that's how Indigenous communities were actually able to function on this land for 10,000 years without even having to use money as a source of exchange. People exchanged their talent. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could actually get back to a society and a world and a global culture that was able to do that again? But that has to come from valuing each person, people over profit.
Thank you. Thank you for saying all of that. No, it was lovely and absolutely beautiful. You're giving me so many things to think about, and so many, like, I'm going to be up all night just thinking about everything that you've said, because it's been so incredibly powerful. We are moving into the question period. So if you got a little bit of time, yes, we have a question that popped up. No, great. We're fine. If folks are sticking around with us, then we'll stay here all night.
Bottled in my head for so long, and some of them I've been able to share, and others, like, I've only my own talking to myself.
But it's great. I mean, you had shared earlier off camera, and some of you may have caught it, that you speak in heralds, and it's so fascinating to watch, because you'll start, and then you'll go into a story and another story and another story, and then, like you said, you bring it back and bring it back and bring it back, and it all comes into this beautiful answer, which is so incredibly wrapped and thorough, and it's so, I appreciate it so much, and you've given me, and I'm sure everybody who's watching, so many things to think about. So thank you, Kathy. Here's your first question. This comes from Sam, and Sam says, drawing on the specific intent of the recent article on the SAM dissolution, would a theater futurism workshop be feasible? Could there be some worth and buy-in in a series where we can workshop Seattle theater's future? What are your thoughts on that?
I would love that. I should say there is a collective of artists, she's got a married name. Is it Woods? J. O'Leary. She just, so I'm not sure if she still goes by that, but there's an effort that's been going on. It just started, but it's where theater companies have been meeting together via Zoom. I think we've had 2 meetings so far, and it is kind of looking at what can the future of theater look like, given the constraints that we are experiencing right now. So, and it's open to, right now it's open to anyone who is kind of a leader of a theater company. But I would love to actually do some more convenings. I think we're going to have to do them via Zoom for a while, but that
right,
just means that more people can be included, right? So there's a bunch of different conversations that actually have to happen right now, and ones that we need to do at a level like the SAM. What would you call it? It was an artistic press release that got a lot of us excited yesterday afternoon for like 10 minutes, but in that 10 minutes, it opened up like so much possibility. If an organization like that could do that, how amazing would it be? And for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, there was a press release that got sent out, and it was on Sam letterhead, and it looked like it came from Sam, but hidden at the very bottom beneath the biography of Sam. So a lot of us who already knew Sam really well didn't like go further than that. And our office was talking about and had a whole meeting about it. And so I was so excited, where they basically put out a press release, or it looked like they had put out a press release that said that they were going to spend the next year basically divesting all of their collection, and sell it off and take the money and invest it in their employees with a pension. So that, again, showing that you're centering people first. And then, but the majority of the divestment of the funds generated would be invested in BIPOC and specifically mostly Black-centered arts and cultural organizations in the city. And I think the reason why it felt so real was because over the last few weeks, that is what Black artists have been calling for around the country is like for museums to divest some of their collection, that a lot of them are just sitting in storage and never even being exhibited. Could they just sell a lot of their collections and invest that in ways that actually give more opportunity for Black artists, Indigenous artists to show their new work? And so it was really exciting for time, and I would love to have some conversations about, let's dream. We're creative beings. Let's dream about what the possibility is, and then make it happen. And I think right now is the opportunity for us to really dive deep into that.
Great. If you have a question for Kathy, go ahead and put it in the forum right now. We'll go ahead and answer that. We'll wait just a couple of seconds longer for that to come through. But Sam, hopefully that answered your question there. And sounds like Kathy is open to the idea of having that conversation for sure. Kathy, just circling back real quick on the continuum that you had shared, that is not a document that is currently on available for people to get. Is that correct?
It's part of our grant application. And so, yeah, it isn't actually like a downloadable form on our website, because we have a lot of issues right now with our website through, again, systemic structures of government. But it is part of the grant application. So I am happy to like pull it out of the grant application to be able to send to people, even people who are not necessarily interested in applying for our grant, for our organizational support grant. But I am hoping that once our IT issues get resolved, we'll be able to post that more. But it is also a document that I can, like every month I'd go back to it, and whatever new learning, whatever new work in community, I try to add it in there so that it's as reflective of, it's as relevant as possible to the current time.
Thank you. You did also say something that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'm just wondering if maybe we could discuss it a little bit further. But you had mentioned that the BIPOC theaters who were applying for the grants were being denied based on the work that they were doing, or not being denied, but not receiving as many grants, simply because the work that they were doing was what they had always been doing, and so therefore it was not seen as groundbreaking and revolutionary.
That's not our office. I want to be very clear.
Okay, I just want,
but nationally,
that's the case.
That is definitely what happened. Sorry, let me finish. Let me let you finish the question.
No. But my question really comes from, for these smaller theaters, so you look at the larger theaters and the large equity houses, and they usually have a massive grant writing team. They have folks who are able to go in there and do the research and find all of the money and recognize what it is that needs to happen. And then essentially, for lack of a better term, manipulate the information so that way they can get the money that they need. Their 7 people can take a look at this grant and go, oh, okay, we need to be diverse. So therefore we're going to do a production of Dreamgirls next season, and we're going to hire an all Black cast. And therefore we've met our diversity inclusion. We can go ahead and submit that for funding. What are some resources that might be available for the BIPOC theaters who don't have that team of grant writers, and who might be able to go after some of the funding that exists out there for the work that they are doing, which is so incredibly important, and not just a grace production, a gimme at some point? That's
a great question. I'm gonna kind of talk around it just a little bit.
Great, I love it.
In the sense of what I actually think needs to happen, though, because of, again, the amount of time it will take to get there, it might not be feasible in the short term. So your question is completely valid, because I think that's what needs to happen in the transition time. What actually needs to happen is that funders we need to just, sorry, there's a loud car outside. We need to just start changing. We need to actually tear apart the funding systems. Last week with my grant team, so I manage the team of people who do all the different grants, and my portfolio is organizational support grants. But I actually said last week, I had an epiphany of, what can we really do to change the systems? I mean, the progression we've been going on is making change systemically, but such a slow pace that it's not enough, especially with the call to action right now. And realizing that really, if we really want to change stuff, there shouldn't be any more funding. I mean, like funders. Like if we truly reached a place where everyone was properly resourced for what they were doing, where we were actually able to pare down the hoarded wealth in this country and share that more equitably, there wouldn't need to be arts funders anymore, because realize that philanthropy comes from it's a very problematic setup to begin with, right? Philanthropy, again, so many systems. I'm trying to distill this as quickly as I can. Here's, for all of our panelists, I'm going into Harold again. For all of our panelists, we do implicit bias training, so racial equity training before they review our applications, because we want to make sure that they are not bringing in biases, which is true for all human beings, but especially white cultural centered biases into the grant making process. And so part of that training that I do is I actually give a really quick economic history of the United States, which really comes down to the fact that pretty much all the wealth, like all that foundation wealth, all those rich families that have a lot of wealth in this country, it's from tobacco, it's from cotton, it's from industry, it's from railroads. If you look at the Dole plantation in Hawaii, I mean, if you look at all of that wealth, our old moneyed wealth in this country, it is literally wealth that is in that was earned off the backs of Black, Brown, Asian, migrant, Mexican labor, all of it. And so the reality is that, but then, you know, these families had so much money. I mean, like so much money, they couldn't even spend it in a lifetime, let alone 2 or 3 lifetimes. They just couldn't spend it. And so, you know, and of course, because of our tax structures, right, the way that they were able to kind of really show up as being good, you know, philanthropists was to give that money away. So they set up these foundations to give that money away. But then who they were giving the money away to were other white people who look like them. And so the people who had actually slaved or worked as indentured servants or brought in as cheap labor to this country, we're getting none of that wealth. And they were the ones who actually did the backbreaking labor to earn it. And so that these systems can, like, these are the hugely inequitable systems. So what we need to do is we need to actually completely get to the point where we're not doing these systems anymore. But we can't do that until we actually figure out better government systems for taxation, better, like everything. Like I'll admit it, I am a socialist. I am a socialist at heart. I just don't think capitalism works in the interests of 99% of our population, no matter what race, but especially for Black and brown people. And so I think the only way, so I actually challenged my team. I said, what can we do that actually moves us faster towards actually doing our work so well that we work ourselves out of a job? Because if we can actually work ourselves out of a job of philanthropy, I think then that means we've actually reached a place where people no longer need that kind of support because they're actually able to be holistically supported through the other systems and structures that exist. And then instead, but see, then everyone always gets scared, because I actually brought this conversation up 10 years ago to a bunch of white funders, where I actually shared my story of like the inequity of why we should create foundations. And it was a room of mostly white men, and they all got really silent, didn't say anything. And then I was never invited to another meeting again, where I said, we should just give all our money to people of color communities and then make the big white organizations apply for the funding. And they're like, no, we can't do that. That would be inequitable. That would be racist. And at that point, there was Poncho organization was in the room. The way and a lot of the funders back then, they literally gave line item budgets to the largest institutions and made all the smaller organizations where most of the BIPOC organizations applied have to compete for funding.
Wow.
So I basically shared their exact same model, but flipped who was the recipient and who had to compete. And That's what they didn't like. It was the same structure they had already created. They just didn't like it when we flipped it, right?
Right.
I don't actually think flipping it works because of the divisiveness I talked about before, but I do think we need to be really revolutionary in how can we actually do reparative justice to balance out where the wealth currently resides, which is really just a form of, I know this is going to get a lot of people riled up, but it is a form of hoarding, because how much wealth can you truly need for yourself to live a magnificent life? And how many people don't even have what they need to even be able to have a meal every day for their child? That kind of inequity, it just boggles my mind that people can live knowing that reality, and that is the reality. Okay, I went way off tangent, but
No. That was great though, because you're highlighting that it's not just, it's so systemic, it's so deep that we have to dismantle all of these structures that are in place and really think about how we're approaching all of these problems from every little brick that goes into creating this foundation that we can then lift each other up. So it's totally fine that you didn't answer the question, but you gave so much more information around it. So thank you. No, I really appreciate it.
But in the short run, we've changed all of our criteria. We like I said, now across all of our different funding programs, 50% of our funds are going to BIPOC communities. We're actually trying to shift it, but like I said, I'm trying to shift it in a way where we're holding all of the predominantly white institutions accountable and actually inviting them. This is the speech I gave this year at our workshops with them, like to be in solidarity of how we work together to actually create a system that works for all of us. Because even though it might feel like as we shift, I actually, like I said, I believe that anyone who goes into theater is doing it because they really want the world to be a better place. And so a lot of the people who are running organizations, even if they are still predominantly white, really don't want trauma or hurt or pain in the artists that they work with, and so they do want to do better. Lots of times it's just then they were just not aware because of the white systemic culture that we are all brought up in. So once they have that awareness opened up, then you see the change. Just really quick examples. When I had more time, I did a bunch of these casting workshops to really talk about the inequities in casting and how it plays out. And like Andrew Russell, who used to be the artistic director at Intiman, came to one of them, and then he brought his whole staff. And he was like, "Whoa, you mean I didn't even think of that. Like I could just tell my directors, like, you need to cast more people of color, like period. Like that's like a no-brainer." And because he was, a person leading a company, could actually just go back to his company, and basically when he hired directors, he said, in order to direct for our company, you need to make sure you're casting more people of color. I mean, that's a very first step, right? It's it's diversity. It's not changing the system so much, but he had the power to do that, and it was just something that he never thought before. In theater, we're always brought up to like, you cast the best person for the role. And best is always, again, normed on white supremacy culture, which is why white people are always getting cast, even though they weren't technically necessarily always the best. But it's because of so many other things, which I could do 5 workshops on. And I probably will try to do someday. But just having that window opened up gave him a whole new perspective. Like he was also taught like directors should have complete freedom to do whatever they want. Well, no, if you're an artistic director, you can, before you hire people, when you interview people, find out, who is willing to be much more open-minded in their casting process. And then of course, there were other people like Matthew Wright at ArtsWest, was just starting out as artistic director at the time and he came to one of my workshops, and again, for him, it was like, oh, wow, like, yes. I mean, like, again, and lots of times it was just because it's not what you're taught in school and college and university programs. So again, that in terms of systemic racism, those are all institutions we need to completely decolonize. And so it's every single system in our culture, and how the media and critics that I've talked about before, like so much of it all connects together, which is why things are so challenging to unravel. But you have to start somewhere. And so so in terms of our arts funding, we have actually made a lot of changes. And I know it's not as visible to the outside world, but for me, I will have to say that it thrills me no end when I see more and more theaters moving in the direction, like Sound Theater's moving in, where the shows that they're choosing, the artists that they're choosing to work with, where, they're making that progress. But again, even as I say all this, the organizations that I still spend the most time with personally, with SIS Productions is, Hansberry Project, SA Teatro, Pratidhwani, Porkalob Productions. It's the organizations that really are led by, centering BIPOC communities and artists, and we do work together. We check in with each other when we can. There's so much that we have to check in with each other on when we're all being used, for our casting expertise. This is really bad. I'm going to share a story because I want people to do better.
Go for it. Do it.
People tap us all the time we're looking for more Black people or Asian people or Indian people, and we spend a lot of time, we don't get paid, and a lot of us won't ask for money and don't demand that, because we want to create that opportunity for all of these artists of color to get that work. So we're willing to do it for free. But then I realized, then it's not fair, because then as artists start working in these theaters, there's a lot of things that theaters take for granted of what they ask of actors of color that they do not ask of other actors, of white actors. And they don't resource it. And I realized that we're actually maybe setting a precedence for why they don't resource it, because we don't ask for anything in return. I still don't feel comfortable asking for money, but what I have started to do is I actually will say, like, I remember the first time I asked a huge theater that has a lot of resources, and the casting director reached out to me, and I spent a lot of time doing a lot of outreach for this musical that they were doing, that they needed an all Black cast for. And so all I asked for in exchange, and again, they did not offer anything, so I had to kind of put out the ask. I said, can I just get 4 comp tickets, not for myself, I'm actually willing to pay to go see the show, but I would like the 4 comp tickets because I'm mentoring some young actors right now, and I would love for them to be able to see the show for free and not have to pay. And the casting director was like, oh, I'll have to check on that because that's not my department. And then I never heard back from her again. I mean, I never even got a thank you for the time that I had doing that. But not even 4 comp tickets for young students of color to come and see the show. And other times I've asked for like just an ad in a program, or even, do you realize, like, all of us, like Valerie Curtis Newton, Roger Chang, Rose Cano, myself, we spend so much time helping other people cast their shows and offering names, which I will say is actually at our detriment, because when we give these names and they get cast in those shows, that means when we have a show, we're not able to use those actors because they're busy. They're already tied up with another show. So it's actually sacrificing our livelihoods for the benefit of these other theaters. But when we look at the program and people's theater programs, they'll thank the Seattle rep for borrowing that set piece, or they'll thank, that printing company for giving them some free printing. They'll thank all of these other things, and they don't even put our name. Like, I don't even need my personal name, but at least put my company's name, SIS Productions or Field Productions, or, Hansberry Project, in the thank yous in your program, because what we gave you was our labor of time, which is human resources, is a much more valuable thing than like you got some free postcards from a company. And anyway, but that is the inequities and that's just that. These are just tiny examples. There's huge ones that we've endured that people take for granted. And so, now I'm being much more vocal about it. And like I said, 3 years ago, I actually brought this up with a group of theater companies, and I have yet to see, only other than a few of them, most of them haven't shown like that they've changed at all. So I'm challenging you all. These are small baby things. This is not even systemic change. This is just tiny, tiny requests. And if you can't even do the tiny requests, then maybe funding does need to completely shift.
What you're saying is resonating with a lot of the folks who are viewing. People are thanking you and calling it out and saying, yes, absolutely. Kathy, we have gone over 2 hours, and which is great. No, I could do this all night because you have so much information, and everything you're saying is, like I said, I'm just going to take this and I'm going to stew in this for a while and just think about all of the things that you have said and how I can be better and what I can do to be a better ally and just person out there in general. I do want to just be cognizant of the time as we are starting to wrap up, because you have been so generous with yours. So we are going to wrap up our interview here. Do you have any final thoughts that you would just like to share with the audience before we go?
Yeah, I was actually going to I can actually finally answer your question about what resources for BIPOC communities. I will say that I test piloted over the years different where of just again, it goes back to that first thing that I kind of threw down the gauntlet with when I first got into my role with those white funders, where I just said, what if we set up grant funding where BIPOC communities did not have to apply, because there's already a huge inequity in terms of who's getting the funding and who even has the ability to spend the time to apply for funding. And so a few years ago, I actually did test pilot a program where another department was giving us some funding, and they specifically needed some work that was being done along the light rail corridor. And it was around gentrification. And so I put together a whole paper on how I think we could do this funding, and use Voulay. He's writes NF. I can't remember the name now. Sorry, it just popped out of my head. Nonprofit with Balls. That's what it is. Nonprofit with Balls, or Nonprofit AF. And he talks about don't make people compete. And this is what I hear from communities of color all the time. That's a residual symptom of structural racism. Structural racism is really designed where it keeps the 1% having all the power and wealth, and it forces the 99% of the other people competing and fighting against each other. And it keeps us separated and isolated. And so with this test pilot program, I did a ton of research into which BIPOC organizations, community-based organizations, actually had mission statements that were working on the exact issue that we wanted to address, and funded them deeply, like $25,000, $50,000 grants. I mean, the whole amount of money was only $150,000, so it was only able to fund 6 organizations at that level. And all I was asking for return was just, about 20 hours of their time over the course of a year. People were like, that's way too much money for that amount of time. And I was like, but see, we're not just resourcing them for I could pay them $100 an hour to come with me for 20, hours. And that's like a couple of $1,000s. That's nothing. But the reason why I said we need to fund them that deeply is because just taking a person of color who's running an organization away from their office and their work for 20 hours is huge. It's huge. And so I need to not only pay them for their time, but I need to pay them for the fact that this is added on top of they're already working far more than other people are already at their organizations to keep it running, and they're getting paid far less than anyone else for it. So it is a form of reparative justice in terms of funding. And so I want to, we actually have a couple of different programs that we've been piloting in that way. Now, the tragedy, of course, is that, again, in order to create that non-competition thing, we don't have enough money that can go that far. So we're actually starting some conversation. And actually, the reason why I want to bring this up is because I am going to be putting together another kind of think tank. I'm trying to pull together how I can resource this so that we can actually spend some time having these conversations. And I promise in those spaces I'll shut up more so that I can actually hear people speak, because that's what I actually value the most, is hearing people speak, and try to figure out how we can do better. But the biggest thing, the change that I've been able to make is that 80 to 100% of our panelists are people who represent BIPOC communities. So it's at the decision-making level. These are the people who are making the decisions about where the funding is going. 80% of my grant-making team are people of color, and I think that's the first place that you need to make the change. We need to be at the table making the decisions. It can't be, oh, this is something I didn't get to touch on, so I'll touch on really let you hear. It can't be. We so value our white allies, but there is a danger sometimes of people becoming like developing that white savior mentality of, oh, those poor people of color, they're suffering so much. We're going to come in and help you and then take the glory for it. That's still steeped in very white supremacy culture of, and no, what we're asking for is we have the expertise, we have the creativity, the innovation, the ideas, we have the lived experience of what true inequity is. So we know what needs to be fixed. We just need to be at the tables that were created by systems that were not designed for us to be at, in order to flip those tables around so that we can actually create a holistic society where we can all be at the table as true equals. And again, if we go back to those indigenous values, there will be enough for us all to eat at that table. There doesn't have to be this animal farm mentality of, now, I'm going to take the power from you and now you're going to be left behind. No, I think if we really center Black lives in this moment, and also indigenous communities, and the only reason why lots of times they're not centered is because all the data people say the numbers are too statistically insignificant, and it's because the whole population of all the different tribes that existed here were basically massacred in order for us to live on this land. And so I do always like to make sure when we call out that we're centering it on where there's the greatest disparities economically, and in terms of legal laws in this country, but also always remembering our indigenous roots of this country, and the only reason why there's not the statistical disparity in there is because the populations were basically decimated. And so, but if we really center how we can really create true equitable systems by starting with where there's the greatest inequity, then all of us will truly benefit from that. Just think of what it would be like to live in a world where all of us could actually live to our fullest potential, where we're all seen and heard and valued. And yes, that does mean that there needs to be a rebalancing, but that rebalancing can be liberating. And I think that's why that SAM press release really opened, like, I actually read that press release and thought, wow, if I was a staff person at SAM, I would feel true liberation. Like, and going back to your pandemic question, again, I'm doing the Herald. Your pandemic question, like the path out of this is, like, think of it like an organization like SAM that has so much art of so much value just stored away in storage rooms, where it could actually be used, where if that money could be divested and invested in a way where, like, stored and hoarded wealth doesn't benefit anyone. But if all the people who had more wealth than they could use in 10 lifetimes just shared it, across the country, we would all be able to live in comfort and live in a holistic society where where we didn't have to have guilt or fear or worry because we all had enough. And what is enough isn't about hoarding. And a pandemic thing hit me today, that you know how when at the very beginning of this pandemic, like people were hoarding tissue paper,
right?
Like, what are you going to do with that much toilet paper? Seriously. Like if everyone just got the toilet paper that they needed, then everyone would have enough toilet paper. But no, some people hoarded toilet paper, so then other people couldn't find toilet paper. Like, why do we do that? Now, if we just got the toilet paper that we needed, then everyone could have toilet paper. There does not have to be a lack of resources. We have so many resources. It's because we're centered on a capitalistic society where it's all about me first, being the winner, being the one on top, being like just thinking of yourself, having to win the race, hoarding wealth, that ownership, taking credit for, ego. Those are all these values that do not honor humanity of collective, a village of people. We have to stop getting away from that individualistic centering, and which the occupant in the White House is the perfect embodiment of, and come to one that is much more collective, collaborative, and then we will actually all be able to live in much more joy than. No one can say that they're living in true joy right now, no one. But if we all really opened ourselves to each other and support each other, I think we could actually get closer to that. Okay, sorry.
No, that was great. I think that's a great note to end on, Kathy, is honor the collective and our village of people so we can live in joy. That's a beautiful sentiment, and I appreciate and thank you for sharing that. And on that note, we are going to wrap up our evening. So I want to just thank everybody for being here this Tuesday evening and spending the evening with Kathy and myself. Kathy had many wonderful, powerful things to say. And if you want to catch this, you can catch it on the YouTube channel. Just search for Deep Dive with Harry Turpin. It'll be up there. Leave your feedback. It'll also be posted on my director's page. And we will be back next. I'm not sure who my next guest will be, but as soon as I know, I will post it on the page. Again, thank you to Kathy Hsieh for sharing her time and her talent with us this evening. And for Deep Dive, I'm Harry Turpin reminding you to trust yourself, to be yourself. Thanks so much.